So, without further ado, I give you Daniel Griffith.
Thank you. This is not the first time that I've addressed the Nottingham Pagan network, but it is the first time that I've visited you at your new venue, which is very nice and a lot less noisy than the last one. I have, of course, spoken in Nottingham before. I've spoken at Imperium 4 or 5 times now, and I visited the Salutation some years ago for an event that was organised by the Clan of Tubal Cain. So I'm not a stranger here, but I've never yet met Rosie, which I believe is the ghost downstairs. She won't talk to me. I'm aware that tonight's lecture is being recorded and may be broadcast live or at some future time. It is therefore necessary for me to clarify the copyright status of the lecture tonight. Although I, Daniel Bran Griffith, retain the copyright of the content of this paper and the associated research, I grant in perpetuity to the trustees of the Nottingham Pagan Network the right to use, broadcast, or to otherwise share any recordings made tonight for non-commercial educational purposes. And Howard has a signed copy of that release. So if you can save your questions for the end, and I will begin. And I begin with a poem, which many of you may know. Who killed Cock Robin? I, said the sparrow, with my bow and arrow. I killed Cock Robin. Who saw him die? I, said the fly, with my little eye. I saw him die. Who caught his blood? I, said the fish. With my little dish, I caught his blood. Who'll make the shroud? I, said the beetle. With my thread and needle, I'll make the shroud. Who'll dig his grave? I, said the owl. With my pick and shovel, I'll dig his grave. Who'll be the parson? I, said the rook. With my little book, I'll be the parson. Who'll be the clerk? I, said the lark. If he's not in the dark, I'll be the clerk. Who'll carry the link? I, said the linnet. I'll fetch it in a minute. I'll carry the link. Who'll be chief mourner? I, said the dove. I mourn for my love. I'll be chief mourner. Who'll carry the coffin? I, said the kite. If it's not through the night, I'll carry the coffin. Who'll bear the pall? We, said the wren, both the cock and the hen. We'll bear the pall. Who'll sing a psalm? I, said the thrush. As she sat on a bush, I'll sing a psalm. Who'll toll the bell? I, said the bull. Because I can pull, I'll toll the bell. All the birds of the air fell a sighing and a sobbing when they heard the bell toll for poor Cock Robin. The people behind. Do you want to come through?
Only one people. Let's see.
Thank you. Sam will tell me if it's wrong. I first discovered the potential esoteric and folkloric interpretation of the Sherwood cycle in the book Witchcraft, a Tradition Renewed by Evan John Jones, the then Magistrar of the Clan of Tubal Cain. It was only a paragraph, and it referred to the inclusion of the mythology of Robin Hood and Maid Marian within some secret streams of traditional witchcraft. That book, without doubt, changed my life. I experienced a literary epiphany, and that short paragraph was enough to set me on my own quest for Robin Hood. That is actually the title of the book by Jim Jones, published in 1987, and it is one of the many works that I now recommend. My approach to Robin, Marian, John, and the legends of Sherwood is not primarily focused on the history, but the study of meaning. I'm interested in symbolism. I explore folklore within the context of myth. And when I speak of myth, I do not mean a story used for the entertainment of children. I mean a sacred story of spiritual significance, containing signposts to our own personal gnosis. The door to wisdom is allegory, that is the story itself, but the key is metaphor. I am therefore an esoteric folklorist. My approach is mythopoetic, an adjective describing the poetic interpretation of myth, legend, and tradition, somewhat different from the noun mythopoesis, which is the creation of myth, although we should perhaps recognize that by reinterpretation, we are in effect recreating. I've been producing work exploring the symbolism of the Robin Hood legends for over 10 years now, and my articles have appeared in several publications, including Hedgewitch Magazine, Pagan Dawn, and Silver Wheel. There are probably less than a dozen people in Britain today who study the legends of Sherwood from this esoteric folklorist perspective. It is a narrow field. Writing in 1996, Ronald Hutton noted that the study of Robin Hood had taken two divergent paths, and I quote, "From the beginning of the scholarly investigation into the legends about the outlaw, it has been obvious that at the end of the Middle Ages, he had been celebrated in plays as well as ballads. Two very different approaches to research into his legend were proposed in response. The first, by Joseph Ritson in 1795, assumed that Robin had been a real human being. The second, started by Thomas Wright in 1837, opined that he was originally a woodland god, honoured in the May revels. This latter argument gained more support in the early 20th century. Douglas Kennedy and Lord Raglan suggested that he had been the dying and returning god of vegetation, postulated by Sir James Fraser as a universal focus of devotion in ancient religion. Margaret Murray, copied by Robert Graves and Pennethorne Hughes, hailed him as the high priest of a coven of pagan witches, representing the horn god of nature, worshipped by the witch cult which Murray believed to have existed in medieval times. Each generation reinvents history, by which I mean not the changing of facts, but the reinterpretation of what has gone before. This is a form of historical revisionism, but lacking the political Marxist overtones. Each figure from history, mythology, and literature is given a fresh interpretation, balancing the traditional with a new approach. Robin Hood is one of many figures who has undergone this reinterpretation, but Robin is a difficult figure to analyse. This is because Robin Hood is a literary figure, a legendary one, with a defined folklore, and it may still surprise many, Robin Hood is also an historical one. It is our human nature to search for and adopt heroes, heroines, and role models. It is a basic human requirement stretching back to the dawn of mankind. Robin Hood, as the historical figure, is rather different from the literary and from the mythological, which will, of course, be the main focus of this paper. This difference in the factual or historical presentation of Robin Hood from the literary or folkloric interpretation is not unique to him. The interpretation appears to have a base within the need for anti-establishment figures, people able to stand up for the lower strata of society against those in power. Robin Hood, with the fictional stealing from the rich to give to the poor, is a clear example of this. Throughout history, there has been an adoption of truly unsavory figures as folk heroes, from pirates to highwaymen such as Dick Turpin. The so-called common folk have been surprisingly active in the adoption of cutthroats, rapists, and murderers as heroic figures. In the USA, these supposed folk heroes include Bonnie and Clyde, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James. In Australia, the most famous murderer turned folk hero is Ned Kelly. None of these historically attested figures were particularly heroic. They were criminals, and at least one of the real bandits, calling themselves Robin Hood, was as much a cutthroat as any other outlaw. He may indeed have stolen from the rich, but importantly, he kept the money and did not give it away. Dr. Tony Rotherham, an historian, an actor, and a stuntman, maintains that provisionally and potentially he can identify over half a dozen different historical examples of an outlaw using Robin Hood as a nom de plume. This means that when we wish to discuss Robin Hood, we are left wondering which one. Robin is a diminutive of Robert, in the same manner as Bill is a diminutive of William and Jack a diminutive John. Robert and Robin, like John and Jack, were once very common names. References we have to a Robert or a Robin may not be the same people as those named elsewhere. The historical basis of the legends I leave to those with greater expertise in that area. My particular area of interest is the symbolic meaning of the themes found within the legends of Sherwood, and of the two divergent paths described by Professor Ronald Hutton, I take the folklorist. Like the Arthurian legends, that are also predominantly Christian in tone, one must look beneath the more superficial and publicly acceptable layers, first separating the historical from the mythological. Once this is done, one can begin to explore both canons within the context of folkloric and esoteric symbolism, taking allegory as both our inspiration and our measure on the quest. One rather difficult aspect regarding the interpretation and deciphering of the Sherwood cycle is that it does not appear to follow the usual pattern of Jungian archetypes, or the motifs of accepted literature. For example, Arthur is the lost prince or the golden child. He's an individual who grows up ignorant of his true identity. He is ignorant of his royalty and his special place in the world. Luke Skywalker in the original 1977 Star Wars is the same golden child, and like Arthur, he is guided by that other Jungian archetype, the sage or wise man. Obi-Wan Kenobi is Merlin. In the Harry Potter stories, the main character is this same lost prince, and like the others, he has his own elderly guide, Dumbledore. Issues can arise when we search for other motifs, themes, and archetypes. In the Harry Potter stories, Hagrid and Ron Weasley take turns as the comic relief. In Star Wars, this role is represented by several characters, but primarily by two robots. Where are these themes in the Ballad of Robin Hood? Protagonists are easy to identify. We can easily draw comparisons between Darth Vader of Voldemort and the Sheriff of Nottingham. Other roles are less clear and raise questions of validity. Is Hagrid a version of Little John? Is Friar Tuck the only comic relief in the Sherwood cycle? Issues arise yet again in regards to the early ballads, as it is Robin himself that takes on the role of comic relief, frequently involved in adventures that require his rescue by Little John or Will Scarlet. Robin is neither the best fighter nor the best archer. Both honours belong once again to Little John. His leadership is based on a natural charisma and the ability to see the greater plan, even though he may miss some minor details. It was the Elizabethan playwright Anthony Munday who, in The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, began what has been called the gentrification of Robin Hood. This modification of Robin Hood reaches its apotheosis in the 1883 novel, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood of Great Renown in Nottinghamshire by Howard Pyle. Almost everything we see relating to Robin Hood on stage or on television and on film since then is a combination of Munday and Pyle. Many writers would suggest that in the search for Robin Hood, or perhaps our quest, we should focus on the 5 early ballads. Their reasoning is that the later ballads are more susceptible to fashion. The change from common outlaw to disenfranchised Norman lord is made to appeal to the aristocracy, who at the time were beginning to take an interest in the stories, perhaps even before Anthony Munday put quill to parchment. The majority of writers, including Mike Dixon Kennedy, writing in 2006, Michael Dacre, 2013, focus on this canon consisting of the 5 earliest ballads and 1 play. These 6 primary sources are Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and the Potter, Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, the death of Robin Hood, unsurprisingly and obviously, the little jest or jest of Robin Hood, and finally the play Robin Hood and the Friar. Jest, spelled G-E-S-T, and sometimes with an E on the end, means a story of deeds or exploits. It is an archaic Middle English word of the 13th century from the Old French, usually associated in use with verse romance or semi-historical narrative. Quite literally, the jest of Robin Hood translates as the tales of Robin Hood, and that was formerly the name of the tourist attraction here in Nottingham. Everything that comes after these 6 primary sources are shadows and are said to be copies and reworkings. Robin Hood and the Monk dates from 1450. The others are of a similar age or dated to around 1500 to 1530. Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, although first printed in the 17th century, is believed by some scholars to be older than Robin Hood and the Monk. These primary sources are not where our story begins. Stories of Robin Hood, Maid Marian, and the Merry Men existed before being formally recorded. They existed as an oral tradition of ballads, tales, and importantly, as plays. It is from the oral tradition that elements of potentially earlier tales may have found their way into the later sources. Marian, our love interest and much more, appears quite late. She is mentioned in a poem by Alexander Barclay in 1508, but does not take centre stage in the tradition until the end of the century. Sometime after 1280, a French poet called Adam de la Helle had composed a poem called Robin and Marian. In this poem, Robin is not an outlaw. We cannot be certain that this is our Robin and Marian. If this is our Robin and Marian, this is our earliest reference, and it is French, not Saxon, and certainly not English. Although it is important from the point of view of historical accuracy, the origin of Robin Hood the man is not relevant to the mythology. From the perspective of folklore, it doesn't matter whether he came from Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Scotland, or even Wales. It's where he lived and dies that matters within the heroic tradition. In the ballads, Robin Hood is a yeoman of Norman stock. His companions are villeins, or Saxon villagers. They are tenants, not landowners. His ability to lead and his natural place as their leader is based upon his being higher up the social order than they. It was Walter Scott in 1819 who first made Robin Hood a Saxon. At the core of the Sherwood tradition, as a mythopoetic study, is the relationship between Robin Hood, his companion Maid Marian, and other changing characters that provide balance. If we can accept that Robin is the god or a spirit of the greenwood, ruling through spring and summer, we begin to see the necessary symbolic associations. In the legends, he wears a bright green, the colour of the woodland. He's an outgoing and energetic character, a leader and a protector. He is the Oak King, and may even be equated, due to some common symbolism, with Puck or Robin Goodfellow. There are actions and associations, such as killing with the royal deer or perhaps an imperial stag, that link him both to Herne and Woden. It has been argued by many writers that Robin Hood is a Saxon manifestation of the divine archer, a god with numerous precedents found throughout Indo-European mythology. In the ballad Robin Hood and Little John, what has become one of the most famous scenes in the cycle is described, the first meeting of Robin and John. The two heroes meet as strangers on a natural bridge that has been formed by the fall of a tree across a stream. Each wishes to pass to the other side, but each is unwilling to retreat and allow the other to do so. They fight for the right to cross first, and the chosen weapon is the English quarterstaff. A quarterstaff is a thick hardwood pole used as a weapon and a walking aid, usually measuring between 6 and 9 feet long. Its use as a weapon is a traditional English martial art, sometimes called a short staff to distinguish it from the long staff or pike measuring 11 or 12 feet. The quarterstaff was usually plain but could on occasion be fitted with metal points. Quarterstaff is a 16th century term, referring to how the pole is made by being cut from the quartered trunk of a felled tree. Poorer quality staffs would be made from tree branches and would therefore be weaker and prone to snapping. John has his own quarterstaff, but Robin does not and must cut a new one. This he does from an oak tree nearby, and we can assume that it is of poor quality, as it is a fresh cut branch and unseasoned. After a great fight, which is near evenly matched, the strength of little John prevails, and in mighty stroke sends Robin into the stream. Robin pulls himself out by a thorn bush, and with a remarkable good grace congratulates John on being the better man. The association of Robin with the summer is suggested by the cutting of a staff from an oak tree. This is the traditional wood of choice for the quarterstaff, but whether purposefully or not, the writer of this ballad has emphasised that Robin is the Oak King. He has done this by stating unambiguously that Robin cuts his staff from an oak tree. The choice of wood used by John is not mentioned, although in reality it would probably be made of oak. But for the purpose of meaning, we accept that it could have been holly. We are meant to assume that if one protagonist uses an oaken stave, then the other would obviously be using holly, and he is therefore the Holly King. There are other versions of this story, and in one, Robin uses an ash tree to make a quarterstaff. The great ash, the Yggdrasil, in the world tree of Norse mythology, and although the use of an ash pole may change our symbolism, it may yet emphasise Robin's association with Woden. Our two heroes have met and fought over a stream representing a boundary between two worlds. They meet at the hedge, standing on the liminal threshold between summer and winter. To pull himself out of that void or stream, Robin has used a nearby thorn. This can only be hawthorn or whitethorn, a tree of the fairy queen, the queen of Elfland. It is fate that decrees the victor, and victory is given to the Holly King, as summer makes way for winter. One can go further and suggest that whitethorn as the tree of summer, balanced by blackthorn as the tree of winter, represent the two faces of fate. The dark twin is Guy of Gisborne. He replaces John as the Holly King in the legends to provide the necessary balance. Guy makes his living as a bounty hunter and is described as being clad in darker clothing, wearing a horsehide cloak, with the facial mask as a hood. These associations, a hunter of people, the horsehide, and the brown clothing, mark Guy as a symbol partly of death, but primarily of winter. The horse links him with the crone goddess of winter, and he may even share some symbolism with the Marilud of Wales. In the ballad Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, we see the battle of the Oak and the Holly Kings for the right to rule. Robin is near defeated in his fight with Guy of Gisborne, but finds new strength by calling upon the Virgin Mary. Robin defeats Guy of Gisborne, decapitating and mutilating his body. Robin has not called upon the Catholic saint in the conventional sense, but upon the goddess of fate, the queen of the otherworld or Elfland, represented physically by the maid Marion. It is fate that decides who shall rule, and here she gives victory to Robin as he banishes winter. This time, and unlike the ballad Robin Hood and Little John, victory is granted to the Oak King. The symbolism of swords and stones, their pairing and unification, is a common motif in mythology. The most obvious illustration is that within the Arthurian cycle. where a sword must be pulled from a stone to confer a valid and rightful kingship upon the bearer. Here, the actual penetration of the rock by a blade is a symbolic representation of the divine union of heterogender principles, the unification of the Sky Father with the Earth Mother, the Hieros Gamos itself, in which the god and goddess are conjoined. By drawing the sword, Arthur takes upon himself the role of an earthly representation of the divine King of Heaven, recognizing that his kingship is granted or bestowed by the goddess herself. To again validate his claim to kingship, Arthur marries a recognized princess, and it is the marriage to Guinevere that confers his rights, for it is she who represents the goddess manifest on earth. In a mythological and poetic sense, Arthur is a divine king and a solar hero. There are no magic swords in the ballads of Robin Hood, but there is another phallic symbol of significance, that is the arrow. We have child ballad number 152, first recorded in the 18th century, but older. That ballad is Robin Hood and the golden arrow, not a silver arrow, a golden arrow, symbol of the sun and masculine in association. Walt Disney correctly used a golden arrow in the 1973 film Robin Hood, but Richard Carpenter, in the Robin of Sherwood television production, changed it to silver as he wished to introduce a lunar symbolism. Parts of this ballad are near identical to the Jest of Robin Hood, dating from the 15th century. According to J.C. Holt, possibly as early as 1450. Similarities in text suggest that it was known to the compiler of the Forester's manuscript, which, although only discovered in 1993, has been dated to the 17th century. The ballad was, according to researchers at the University of Rochester, known to the author of Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, which itself can be dated to 1476, and is notable for being the first ballad to feature Friar Tuck. The concept of sovereignty runs through British and Irish mythology like a precious thread. In the Irish cycle, it is the Morrigan who may represent the sovereignty of the land. In the British Isles and the Arthurian cycle, that archetypal representation is Guinevere. In the English Midlands, it is the Maid Marian and other Queen of the May, who holds the same sacred position and by whose marriage Robin Hood reigns as consort. Today, the importance of Maid Marian and her place in the mythos is overlooked. Maid Marian is often portrayed as being purely a love interest for Robin, an excuse for daring exploits on television and in film. However, in the ballads, Maid Marian is seen to wield both sword and bow, often dressed as a boy. This is no shrinking violet, but an active member of the partnership, the band of outlaws. Marian is a maid, but not necessarily a maiden. Her relationship with Robin Hood and her activities within the legends transcend the social mores of the period. She is mistress of her own fate. Her Maytide marriage to Robin Hood bestows upon him the right to rule. Maid Marian is the sovereignty of the greenwood, and Robin Hood as a consort reigns by right of the sacred union. The merry men, the word merry is derived from the Saxon meaning retinue or retainer, serve as their household. The model represented in the Sherwood cycle is therefore comparable to the Arthurian cycle, if we make this imaginative connection to the symbolism of the golden arrow as a representation of kingship. A much later historical example of the warrior maid can be used as a poetic example of sovereignty and the granting of kingship. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, is a documented historical figure who, like those previously mentioned, has become a legend. Joan the Maid took up the sword to drive out the English and place Prince Charles the Dauphin of France on the throne as King Charles VII. Saint Joan, or Joan the Maid, is in the process of developing her own mythology, both within the Catholic Church and within some streams of traditional craft. This is truly mythopoesis, and we can learn a lot from Shakespeare if he's read with care. The death of Robin Hood is the closing instalment of the legend, and it is an ending within a beginning. The main elements are that Robin is of an age that he's feeling his powers wane. He travels to a spiritual or religious site. He's bled by a woman of holy orders that some identify as a relative, and finally, just before his death, he shoots his last arrow. I'm sure that all of you know this story. In Robin Hood, as a person now feeling his age and becoming aware of the loss of his powers, we see the divine king who is no longer in his prime and must step aside. Where better to do this, to carry out a final sacred act, than a place of religious or spiritual significance. In the legends, Robin seeks healing and travels in the company of John to Kirklees Priory in West Yorkshire. On their arrival, the prioress takes Robin to be bled, a common enough medieval treatment. In Child Ballad 120, we have this last journey of Robin Hood described in two versions, text A and text B. Text A is the older, it's more primitive, and rather less refined. It's also sadly incomplete. In text A, but not in text B, Robin and John meet an old woman by a stream. She is weeping for Robin Hood and cursing his name. It is a warning of harm, as she knows he is travelling to Kirklees to be let blood, but Robin chooses not to take heed. Clearly, this is a supernatural phenomenon, an omen, and she is reminiscent of the washer at the ford of Irish mythology, stationed as she is on the stream, the liminal boundary between two worlds. She is his fate. Here there are 2 points of significance. The first being that we have the giving up of what can be seen as the blood royal, the holy blood of the king. The divine king is now the sacrificial king. The real historical Robin Hood is likely to have been poisoned, but from an esoteric perspective, the shedding of the blood royal is of greater significance. The second point of significance is that a holy woman, who may possibly be a member of the same clan, carries out, or at least supervises, the bleeding. Once again, we meet Our Lady, the goddess of fate, but now she is in the guise of the Pale Mother, detached, impartial, and doing what must be done. Knowing death is at hand, Robin forbids John from taking revenge on the Abbey. Robin accepts his role as sacrificial king and calls for his bow. His final act is to fire one last arrow, declaring that he is to be buried or laid to rest wherever it lands. It takes strength to draw a bow and fire an arrow, more strength than an old man, weak and dying, would be expected to have. The shooting of this last arrow is the final heroic act of the dying Robin Hood, but it is purely a symbolic one. The arrow is the spirit of Robin Hood, soaring high to his place of rest, the sun, the sky, the halls of the Saxon gods. It's also a shaft of light representing his divinity, the passing of his power and his office to another. Robin Hood is symbolically buried where the arrow falls because the spirit of the divine king comes to rest within the next recipient of the arrow. Writing in 1995, Phillips and Keatman devote an entire chapter to Marion and the Prioress of Kirklees. They are addressed together as being interlinked. Marion is the alpha and the Prioress is the omega. One bestows kingship and the other brings it to an end. One is sovereignty and the other is fate. Drawing upon Robert Graves, we have the goddess whose colour is white. In truth, Maid Marian and the Prioress of Kirklees are two faces of the same being. One is Whitethorn and the other is Blackthorn. Both represent sovereignty and both represent fate. And that is the first half. Thank you. I hope that so far I've given you a fresh insight, possibly given you a few surprises, and perhaps some things you're sitting there going, he's mad, that's bullshit. Who knows? Anyway, part two, a bit shorter. Probably less surprises in this one because it's going to be a fairly obvious one. Because we cannot discuss the folklore of Sherwood in a modern context without looking at a very famous television series made in Britain and broadcast in the 1980s. Robin of Sherwood was based very much on the accepted notions, stories, and traditions of previous cinematic and television productions, with perhaps one or two major departures. It was not historically accurate, but it was never meant to be. It was entertainment, not a documentary. It did not keep strictly to the narratives of the early ballads, but few have since Elizabethan times. Robin of Sherwood ran from 1984 to 1986, with Robin first played by Michael Praed and later by Jason Connery. From the beginning, it faced controversy, most notably from the National Viewers and Listeners Association and their founder, Mary Whitehouse. The National Viewers and Listeners Association was founded in 1965 as a replacement for the Clean Up TV campaign. That was only 1 year after I was born, so we're going back a long, long time because I'm ancient. It was a pressure group that throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s was often in the public eye. Their objections centered upon sexual matters, nudity, violence, and what they perceived as anti-Christian programming. Dr. Callow, in his 2018 work, observes that Whitehouse had a long history of objections to film and television productions, some not dissimilar in content to Robin of Sherwood. Any Doctor Who fans here? Mary Whitehouse complained about a very famous Doctor Who story called The Demons. Well, actually, she did. She missed it. That surprises you, doesn't it? It surprised me. In that 1971 story, it featured a coven led by the original master, played by the brilliant Roger Delgado, a demon called Azel, and get this, it featured quotations lifted directly from the Gardnerian Book of Shadows. The Devils is a film directed by Ken Russell and starring Oliver Reed. It was released in 1971, the same year as the famous Doctor Who story. Whitehouse did not miss this one, and her complaints added to the controversy that nearly destroyed Ken Russell's career. In the 60s and in the 70s, Whitehouse was a power to be reckoned with. When she took on Richard Carpenter, the creator of Robin of Sherwood and Catweasel, she fared less well. In a famous face-to-face debate, Carpenter introduced himself this way: "I'm Richard Carpenter, and I'm a professional writer." He then turned to look at Mary Whitehouse, and he said, "And you're a professional what, exactly?" Mary Whitehouse replied, "I'm not a professional anything." And Carpenter came back with, "Good, now I know I'm dealing with an amateur." That cutting exchange actually silenced Whitehouse. I observe, and with all respect to the memory of Richard Carpenter, I am not a professional writer or researcher. I am an independent scholar of folklore and the esoteric. I am an amateur. The point I'm trying to make is that people have begun to defend themselves more vigorously and sometimes even win the argument. In the 1980s, the influence of Whitehouse was beginning to wane. She was becoming something of a joke and a caricature of her younger self. There was in the late 80s and early 90s a radio and television comedy program called The Mary Whitehouse Experience. She was even a caricature on Spitting Image. The objections of Mary Whitehouse to Robin of Sherwood kept to the pattern of previous complaints made regards other film and television productions, with one significant departure. Whitehouse objected very strongly to what she perceived as satanic elements in the episode called The Swords of Wayland, and to pagan overtones represented by the character Herne the Hunter. Richard Carpenter knew his Shakespeare, and it is this character, as well as a Moorish warrior, that he introduced to television audiences completely fresh to the Robin Hood corpus. This is what sets his interpretation apart from all others. Herne the Hunter does not feature in the ballads or plays. Any suggested pre-Christian elements, if they exist, are not obvious and remain unclear. Carpenter's interpretation was blatant in its pagan themes with this Lord of the Trees. This character was portrayed by a very fine British character actor, the late John Abernethy. Sadly, his name today is very little known. Herne the Hunter, to paraphrase Callow, is depicted as a rather threadbare shaman, partially masked, dressed in deerskins, and bearing a headdress. The pagan elements are obvious to us now, and they were certainly obvious to Whitehouse in 1984. For those of you who are fans of Robin of Sherwood television series and those with an interest in the mythology behind the legend, I draw your attention to the Robin Hood experience here in Nottingham. The owners have acquired, or rather have been lent, several props from film and television productions, including some from Robin of Sherwood. In one of the upper rooms of this tourist attraction is the Herne the Hunter costume from the television series. This is not a copy, it is the genuine prop worn in the Goldcrest Films television production, and as such it holds a very special place within the Robin Hood environment. The Herne the Hunter costume is on loan to the people of Nottingham from Goldcrest Films, and despite being rather worn at almost 40 years old, is still an important piece of British television history. Its gracious loan, was arranged by the aforementioned actor and historian Tony Rotherham, and for many years the costume was on display at the Tales of Robin Hood here in Nottingham. In bringing this paper to an end, I want to add a caveat to my conclusions, if we can call them that. I do not consider myself to be an expert on this subject, although I am aware that some do consider me to be an authority. That is very flattering, but it's also wrong. The subject matter that I am presenting is, however, subjective. The interpretation of research is influenced by our perception and is not by any means an exact science. Far from it. We must caution ourselves from making wild assumptions and attempt to introduce some rationality. The study of the mythological elements of the Sherwood cycle is an incomplete project. Research is far from over, but it is instead forever ongoing. In the study of folklore and mythology, we do not have all the answers, and I certainly do not. The further and continuing search for evidence and the interpretation of that research is itself a quest. It is my quest, and perhaps some of you here share my quest. Finally, I add this observation. The bells that toll for our cock robin are those of Kirklees and Edwinstowe. May those who are wise understand these things, and the prudent shall know them, for wisdom is too high for a fool. Thank you.
Robin in the figure of the trickster?
I haven't looked specifically at that, to be quite honest with you, but it shouldn't come as any surprise or revelation. My own theory, if you can, or hypothesis, is that Robin Hood as a mythological figure is a proto-Indo-European myth, far older than we think, that has somehow been grafted on to a historical person. So, yeah, I think there's elements of the trickster there. I think they're hidden, but yes, I think that's quite logical. I wouldn't go so far as to compare him with Loki. I think in Norse mythology there are other gods, Holder, for example, that you can compare him with. And I think we can sort of draw comparisons with, as I refer to, certain other mythological figures, particularly Greek mythology. But that's an area I need to really look into. Yes?
In the story, one of the jest-selling features Sir Richard of the Lees,
Yeah.
and there's obviously clearly an element of Robin delighting in putting one over on the establishment represented by the bishop.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the, I was reading up some of my notes earlier today, about that is, you see this little twist in the literary area. In the early ones, he's much more of an anti-establishment figure. And as it develops, he becomes gentified, he becomes more acceptable. And then later on, around about the Victorian period, he starts going into more of a children's story. But he was never originally a children's story, because the early ballads are quite violent, you know, with murder, rape, and all sorts of things, and such things as in putting one over on people. Now, the Bishop of Hereford is naturally interesting with piece there, because the stories that feature that character date from post-Reformation. So the writers have done a sort of historical anachronism and backdated some of the stories as an anti-Catholic piece of propaganda, which of course the Tudors were very popular, very strong on. So you've got running through the legends, the ballads particularly, is political motifs and an underscore. So you've got the common people, in particular in the earlier ones, having a go at the aristocracy. Then it starts to twist slightly. And the aristocracy are being attacked, but you've still got to attack someone, so it's going to be an evil lord or a bishop. It's quite interesting politically. And you could read the ballads as a social commentary of medieval England. Yes.
This is less of a question and more of a comment to Mike's thing about the trickster. I was just going to make a recommendation that Tony Rotherham, as you previously mentioned and discussed, has many good examples of Robin Hood being the antagonist and also the chap that has to be saved and being sort of the catalyst for things in a trickster-like fashion. So if either of you wants to research more, Tony Rotherham is a good man to reach out to in that regard.
I can't remember which one it is in now, but there's one of the later ballads, I think, where Robin Hood is making love to a maid of the village, and her brothers come looking for her. And he kills the first one, then goes back to making love. The second one comes and he kills him and goes back to making love. And he does it 3 times. It's like, obviously, the sister didn't care much for her brothers or something. But it's like, it gets sanitized. And then, but the early ballads are not, you know, they're rowdy. They're what people would have been singing in a pub like this.
Yeah.
And they're not children's stories. I mean, there's one observation, I was making a few notes earlier, and this might be worth trying to think about it. In a sense, what we now see as Robin Hood is a 19th century creation, basically stemming from the romantic, artistic and literary movement that gave rise to the pre-Raphaelites, Charlotte Guest's Mabignon, Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur. They're all part of that romantic school. But also at the same time, we have obviously Scott's Ivanhoe. I mean, everyone's favourite, Robin Hood is in Scott's Ivanhoe. What people don't realise is that Scott also wrote another novel called Rob Roy. And you've all heard of Rob Roy. Well, a great hero fighting for the people. The real Rob Roy wasn't quite so nice. Rob Roy McGregor, who lived 100 years before Walter Scott, probably wasn't quite as heroic. But then, in the Victorian period, they invented the kilt and tartans.
Yeah.
They did that. And then at the same time, you've got the Brothers Grimm in Europe collecting what is now the corpus of European folklore. When they finished that, they sat down and wrote a 4-volume study of Germanic mythology. The whole milieu is all interconnected.
And it's been watered down into fairy tales
Yeah, the Victorians made Robin Hood a children's story, which has carried on some tweaks here and there. You got Errol Flynn, not quite a children's story, but fairly good. Disney is the peak, but further back you've got other things going on. Anyone? Hello.
You mentioned that Julius Robin and Marion was by a French poet.
Yeah.
Was this actually a French Robin Hood?
The problem with that one is we don't really have. I mean, I've not actually been able to read it because I can't find an English translation. All I can do is that I've read people's reviews and commentaries of it. It's very unlikely that it is the same Robin Hood and Marion. It may purely be a coincidental name. But it may not be. We don't know. It probably isn't. We're not sure. But this is very interesting because what I find quite interesting about the suggestion that it could be is that it means that the legend, or what we now think of as the legends, the stories, may have started with the troubadour traditions of France, remembering that Richard I, his father Henry II, his brother who came after him, John, they were French. They were Norman French. It was after the Norman conquest. So is it possible that a tradition, stories known in the 13th century to the French court and the Norman court crossed the Channel because the Norman aristocracy was going backwards and forwards between their castles in Britain and Normandy? Is it possible that the aristocracy moved a story and it got grafted onto something else? I don't know, but it's one of the big questions that I would like to have answered.
At this point in time, of course, through a lot of the plantagenets England possessed a lot of France.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, from the time of William up until soon after John, really, because he lost most of it. It's like Henry II is, one of our greatest kings. He was King of England, Lord of Wales, Lord of Ireland. He got given Ireland as a gift by the Pope. The Pope just said, Ireland's yours if you can conquer it. So he did. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine when he was already Lord of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. So at his peak, he was, his sovereign was the King of France, but Henry II was Duke of Normandy, Count of Aquitaine and Poitiers and Maine, actually had more of France in his possessions than the King of France. He had the biggest empire since Charlemagne. So
What one, was it Henry VI who lost the last bit of France in Gascony?
no, there was one, no, Calais was still held by Mary the First. And she lost it. Because in the reign of Elizabeth I, they were trying to marry her off to the Duke of Alençon. And the courtiers of the Elizabethan court wanted Calais as a dowry to get it back. But she never married the Duke, so they didn't get it back anyway. So, no, but John lost most of it. And then they got a lot of it back during the reign of Henry V, and of course the Black Prince before him. And then his son, the imbecile, lost most of it until there was just a foothold around Calais.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I'll get all your books in a second. I came to Nottingham 35 years ago, thinking, great, home of Robin Hood. Disappointed with what I found the sources of what they gave you even back then. Even now, it's got worse. In fact, you're doing it just when the castle was closed. You're doing this talk. And if I were traveling from somewhere in the world, knowing that Robin Hood, what a hero, let's go to Nottingham, let's look at this. Over the years, the various councils have done nothing with it, and not the socialist ones, because obviously he's a socialist hero. What is it in Nottingham, the councils, or whatever, that they cannot embrace this son of Nottingham?
Since I don't live in Nottingham, I'm not sure that I should comment on any kind of political comments on that.
Good answer, good political answer there.
But I will make some observations. You do have a statue. You've got a rather shoddy painting in the back of some shopping centre somewhere. The only thing, you've only got a few things that really link Robin Hood to Nottingham. That's the castle and the church where he killed some soldiers. A lot of his stuff is up north, and this is where, I'm sorry to say it, where the Yorkshire element comes in. Because an awful lot of the stories are up north, and also you've got to take into account the geography here. I won't forget you.
No, I'm replying to him.
The geography, the Foss Way and the Great North Road and all that. Dick Turpin wanted to use it, and Robin Hood was using it before him. It goes all the way straight through past Southall.
Yes.
Great place to sit there and do some robbing. Why come down to a city when you can do it in the countryside and go and hide somewhere? I don't know why they're not embracing him. It seems a very silly thing to do, because Robin Hood and Torval and Dean is what, and Brian Clough and Taylor, they are what puts Nottingham on the map.
But there was a recent Radio 4 comedy, Mark Steele's in town. If anybody went to Mark Steele's in town, and he did it about Nottingham. He says, you've got more about other people. And what's Nottingham famous for? Robin Hood. You do nothing with it. And we do nothing with it. And I'm going to say Farnsfield or Barnesdale or whatever. We hold this and we've done nothing with it.
My answer was literally idiocy. That was going to be my answer. I just wanted to politely let Bran finish what he said. It is.
Moira's being very patient. I think Moira wants to come in.
Moira lives in Edinburgh.
You mentioned Tales of Robin Hood. I've worked in Tales of Robin Hood just across the road there. And it's embarrassing what we do with this figure.
I will come to you, Moira. Just one thing. I think this is where my friend Adam Greenwood is, I think, worthy of another mention. Because his business, the tourist attraction he runs, helps put it back in the public eye. Now, whether or not the fact that that's a private concern and not a council concern means that it's doing better is a political thing that I'm not going to get into. But I think we should credit him for actually getting that further out, more people knowing about it, and certainly bringing in things like the television and stuff like that, which I think does help. But, I can't comment on the council point of view.
No, I'm not asking you to,
No,
but it's interesting that you mentioned Mary Whitehouse and the political aspects of this.
Yes. Robin Hood is a lot more than just a kid's story.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a lot to it. I was going to say something else, I forgot. Moira, what was your?
No, I was just going to that even in Evanston, which is where we had the church where Robin Hood and Marion got married. There's nothing about Robin Hood.
Like you are.
We've got a naff, yes, it is all about referencing. We've got a naff little gift shop. Same paper and birthday card. But that's it, that's the only connection now that Evanston has to Robin Hood. They're taking everything away which are need to create a business centre.
I thought you had a statue.
Well,
you got a
yeah,
statue.
it's not as good as it used to be because it got knocked over.
Right.
Yeah, a couple of years ago. The place is a bit of this.
I'll share. Which was very good. I went to it. It's very good.
And that was wonderful.
Now I will make this little observation. I went to Newark, Civil War town history place, and I went to their what's it called, tourist information shop, and I bought a Hessian shopping bag with Robin Hood on it. I didn't buy it in Nottingham. I didn't buy it in Edwinstown. I bought it in Newark. So other places are quite happy to grasp in and say we can make money or we can promote this. And this is the thing with over the border, in Barnsdale, Sheffield, because they have got a legitimate claim because some of the stories are there, and they seem to be more willing. Where is Robin Hood Airport? Doncaster. Yeah. Doncaster. Yes, Margaret.
Different question. I'm intrigued by what you said about some of the series being related, quoting from Gardnerian Book of Shadows. I want you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Oh,
Where you found out? I'm very curious.
Right. Okay, that's the Doctor Who series, The Demons.
Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
from 1971 or 1972, I can't remember what year I said. You will find it on YouTube, but not complete.
Okay.
But you will find scenes where there are these witches dancing around John Pertwee, they're going to kill him, and he gets rescued, and they are chanting little bits from the Gardnerian. I can't remember the exact wording now, but you will find it on YouTube.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. I don't think it's something that's very, very well known unless you're a real Doctor Who fan. Yes, Howard.
I was going to reiterate and add my strength to what Moira was saying. That when they sold out the RSPB at Sherwood, it all became more to some extent all about the Nicky birds. And
Well,
all
they're taking out most of the bird beasts in the forest.
hardly anything about Robin.
It's.
Can I just say, my interpretation of it is that Robin Hood means so many different things to different people. And there's a variety of interpretations you can put on it. And I think that any kind of thing like a council authority, they don't like anything that can be a bit fluid and open to
That's a good
interpretation.
point.
That could be true.
They like things that they can control.
Robin
They
Hood can
can't
be.
put an authority on it.
It's
They
exactly
don't-
this.
Yeah.
So they're
So-
not buying into Robin Hood because it belongs to the people and it's not something they can control.
Well, I've got 2 points there. First of all, the big problem when it comes to a government agency promoting Robin Hood is the fact that he was a criminal. You know, that is the big thing. It's not like King Arthur, prince, king, or general. You know, it's a bit more of an establishment figure. You are actually promoting a criminal activity, and that throws up what they would interpret as ethical considerations. The other point is this. King Arthur is royalty. Robin Hood, even if he was a Norman yeoman, was still a commoner. And therefore you have the British class system at play. The interpretation of the two stories is maybe based on social economic class.
But that's never gone away, has it? So
No.
we're living it now,
Yes,
so, you know.
So the stories that way, you know, these stories that, you know, do you remember a television series about Dick Turpin, starring
Richard
Richard O'Sullivan? Yeah. They tidied that up no end to make him a hero. You know, this is it, the reinvention of each one. The two people over there.
I was going to say one very closely related thing is many of the modern versions of the story specifically vilify taxation, which no council is going to want to promote.
Yeah, that's very true. Moira, were you going to say something?
No, it's fine.
David?
Just going back to Robin Hood and with the bishop and such.
Mhm.
In the Robin Hood and Monk story, he's actually very devoted to Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Rails against the church.
Mm.
What do you think your reasons are? What do you think his reasons are for doing that?
I think there, this is a difficult one. This is a very difficult one because I think what's happened is that his devotion to the Virgin Mary would, under normal circumstances, be used by Protestants as a stick to beat the Catholics. But it seems to be so ingrained within the mythos of Robin Hood that they couldn't take it out. So you've got that left in as a bit of an anachronism, while they're still attacking the church represented by Hereford. But also the other point to note is that Hereford is a long way from here. I was reading somebody only recently whose name I can't remember now. Let me see if I've got a reference in I've got extensive references which I can put on the group. J. Harasta, Robin Hood, the History and the Folklore of English Legend, private publication. She points out that Hereford, although it was an English town, it was called Hereford on Wales, as in a march town. And for people over here, it was far enough away for them to have critique it, slight it, insult it, without any comeback. Whereas if they'd have started, say, the Bishop of Lichfield, too close, far too powerful. So they pick a sort of semi-anonymous character that they're safe enough to criticise, but still would represent the church. But of course, there was a Bishop of Hereford, and there is a Bishop of Hereford now. So it's based loosely on historical characters. As are many of the things about it. Sheriff of Nottingham is, as you know, there is a Sheriff of Nottingham now. At the time that the ballads are set, it wasn't the Sheriff of Nottingham. It was the Sheriff of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and the Royal Forests. Those Royal Forests were not just in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, that's why they were tagged on. There were some of them in Lincolnshire and some of them in Yorkshire, or what is now Yorkshire. And that's the other thing as well, Sherwood Forest. How big was it? How big do you think Sherwood Forest was?
It was nice, wasn't it? It's Yorkshire.
It covers 3/4 of Nottinghamshire, but it wasn't all woodland because it's a legal term, which I'm sure all of you know. It's open country, it could be heathland, moorland, and some woods, and even some farming country. It's a royal hunting reserve. But it stretched from not far outside of here, as in you've got the borough of Sherwood, up to Sheffield. It went over to the border of Lincolnshire, I will get to you, and then it went west into Derbyshire to reach what is now Chatsworth, Peak Forest, And even Dale Abbey, which is only a couple of miles from where I live, and the monks at Dale Abbey were the same order as the monks at Langton. There was a connection, and if you've ever been to any talks by that wonderful man who knows everything about Nottinghamshire history, Frank Earp, he will talk to you about the trading routes that went from Nottingham to Peveril Castle, and there, which is Peak Forest, and to Dale Abbey, which is not far from where I live. And there's a hermitage at Dale Abbey in a wood, and that wood is ancient woodland. It's a pocket handkerchief of Sherwood. So that's how big Sherwood was. Huge. But it wasn't all woodland. That's important. Sorry.
No, you mentioned about at the time of the ballads. I thought the ballads were written over various centuries.
The ballads seem to start being written down sometime after 1450 and go on for about 100 to 200 years. But they existed as an oral tradition before that.
Yeah.
And there's plays. What's quite interesting is how many historical anachronisms slip in. I've used that word several times because it's full of them. When they were actually written down, or rather edited later, little things were put in that don't fit the times. Hence, you've got this complete confusion. What did Robin Hood exist during the reign of Richard I, which was the 1200s? Or was it Edward I, which was 13 or 14? You've got that completely. The other one is Friar Tuck. Friar Tuck's ballad is set in the high medieval ages during the reign of Richard or John. But there were no friars in England at that time.
Oh.
There were abbeys with monks.
They were brothers.
Yeah, but a friar is a travelling preacher, a beggar. There were no of them. They didn't come to Britain, England actually, not Scotland, but Britain, England, until about 100 years later. The Dominicans didn't come to England until I think it's 10 years after John's death. So a lot of these things are too early. You've got some monk orders, but not the friars.
There is historical records of Shire Reeds of Nottingham from about 1076.
Yes, I think they were one of the very early introductions of William the Conqueror, based partly on a pre-existing Saxon kind of thing. But yes, and the office of the Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire existed for 500 years, and it was only split in the 1500s, which I think would have been one of the late Tudors, Elizabeth or Mary. Yes?
I was going to say, could it possibly be that Robin Hood met Monk Tuck, and because Monk Tuck was travelling with the merry men, he would have been what would become a friar, and they didn't have a word for it.
Basically, I would think so.
And then the anachronism is because later on they were like, rather than putting in this great big long thing of, and then the travelling monk named Tuck, that they just put, hey, we've got a word for that now. We'll put friar. Do you think that's where the anachronism came from?
If Friar Tuck existed, then his origins would be probably a monk connected to an abbey, not necessarily a travelling one. And at some later time, they just called him a friar.
Yeah.
Because when they were writing them down, or when that ballad became popular, friars were commonplace, and if you said to someone, he's a friar, they knew what you meant.
Right.
Whereas if you said, oh, he's a lay brother, they'd go, a what?
And then you'd have to go, well, you did the church structure like this,
and
like this.
And if you're singing a song in a ballad, you want something that rhymes, and trying to get, lay brother to rhyme with anything and not Friar Tuck, it's a bit easier.
Yeah.
What, friar?
Oh,
Careful. Yes.
See, you look so innocent.
yeah,
I'm not. Want me to explain the church structure?
yes.
I hope you're impressed by my encyclopedic knowledge.
I
Oh, I just had
Yes, I had a question about the bridge incident.
Sorry?
The bridge incident.
Yes.
With little John and the stars. I sort of read interpretations of it being a marshy river, and anything with marsh is where the veil is thin between the spirit world.
Precisely. Absolutely
And
right.
is that where, so if he's failing there, is he not broaching that, or what's happening there?
No, it's just an element of symbolism. You've got a bridge that is over a stream, and you've got two bits of land. It's it's a sort of liminal place, and so a marshland is traditionally an area of mystery and stuff. I mean, if you think about the bog bodies that people would sacrifice and stuff, so yeah, the marsh symbolism, the marsh fits the symbolism. The other thing, David would probably be able to correct me, but isn't there in the Mavignon a scene where somebody over water standing on one leg has to do something?
Yes.
Thank you.
They have you this.
Yeah.
So
So
why does
you've
he
got,
not win those?
he doesn't win it, he doesn't win because they want to, or writers do at least, show the strength and superiority of Little John. Little John is the better fighter, he's the better bowman, and the better swordsman. Robin Hood only becomes the better swordsman, the better bowman in the Tudor period and onward. Before then, he's the leader of the band, but he's not the best fighter. In fact, he could probably be whooped by Mitch the miller's son. He's not the best. There is a literary change in the Tudor period when they start cleaning him up.
But why doesn't he bridge that thing between the subliminal thing then? Why? Because
I can't explain all of that. I really can't. It's
We
just-
need to go because I can't find something.
Yeah.
Okay, well, 3
There's
minutes.
the symbolism is in layers all the way. Good luck.
I was moving on to the gracious and the
If I can just backtrack, can you still hear me? Did that get knocked? If I can just backtrack a little bit, I think from my point of view, he's got to lose symbolically because summer gives way to winter. And in the next one, he's got to win because it's the other way around. So it's a definite, he's got to, from a symbolic point of view. From a literary point, it's showing the prowess of Little John, John Naylor. I always find the names really interesting. And you've got Will Scarlett or Scatlock or something like that. Scarlett is quite a common name along the border of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, as is the name Naylor. So the ballads feature local family names, which I find gives it a certain localized historicity. That's all. Yes.
I was just going to say, is it also narratively showing Robin's graciousness in defeat, that he is a good man because he compliments John on being the better man, and then you're like, oh, he's a good guy, he's not a tantrum, petulant child.
He doesn't get up, draw his sword and stab him.
Yeah.
Which is what he probably was doing very early.
Yes.
But yes, he's becoming that one, a gentleman. Yes.
Well done, John, you're the better man.
But also, Little John is willing to accept his honor, like, yes, now you're my leader too, because you have been so gracious to
Yes.
me.
But I think also we interpret him as the leader. But how much of it is really, or is it really his peers? Slightly more on an equal level. It's an interesting thought.
Also demonstrates his vulnerability.
Yes.
Making him a bit more human and
But it's-
accessible.
I was talking to Maddie earlier. The symbolism. It's things like, the drawing of the bow, the last heroic act, shoots a bow through a window, bury me where it lives, John, where it lands, John, please. It's a wonderful piece of narrative. It's a fantastic element in the story. It's also physically impossible. He's 80 years old, possibly. He's just been bled and he's on the point of death. He wouldn't have been able to throw a bow. No chance. It's symbolic. And this is the problem. You've got so much symbolism mixed in with the history and the legend that trying to peel back the layers can be very difficult. Yes?
Just a quick, another plug for Franco, because he talks a lot about Dale, doesn't he? Isn't that where the thing over the bridge happened?
I don't know. When it comes to the actual places that are associated with Robin Hood, I am not that knowledgeable of them because most of them are inventions.
Well,
Did he really kill 6 soldiers in St. Mary's? Or did he perhaps possibly just kill 1 or 2? Everything gets added to. Jesse James is credited with robbing dozens of banks. And historians look at it, it's like 50% of them were made up. He didn't do it. You know, he's accumulated this, and this, and this. But like Dick Turpin's famous ride from London to York. It was done, but not by him.
Yeah.
Another highwayman did that ride on a different horse. And the story got grafted onto Robin Hood, onto Dick Turpin. Yes.
Just back to up on the did he kill 6 men in St. Mary's in the Robin Hood book? He actually writes how he fought some, but then a lot of them feigned death.
Ah.
Yeah, just so they wouldn't get hurt.
I think I would have done that. Yes. Seems a very sensible thing to do. It's like, it reminds me of a story about the 3 dictators. You got Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco have met somewhere just before the war or something to have a meeting, and they're boasting about whose soldiers are the bravest. Okay? So Hitler orders some SS guy to jump off the top of a roof, and he does that. I've lost my pen. He does that, and he breaks an ankle. So everyone's very impressed. Wow, very brave. And then it's Mussolini's turn. So he orders one of his soldiers to go up to a higher building and jump, and he does, but he breaks both his ankles. And then they all turn to General Franco, and General Franco orders one of his soldiers to climb a higher building and jump off. And the soldier turns around to him and says, "Screw you, do it yourself." General Franco won the argument. His soldier was brainless. It's a way of doing it, isn't it? Any more?
Right, are we?
I'm going to try and say one thing. You know the story with the Robin Hood? If the story came back, because back then with the taxation and all the big Nottingham sheriff raising all the taxes, was it because they needed the people back then needed a hero, needed a figurehead to believe it?
Yes, yes. Yeah, as I said, there's an element of the
to get that far.
Yeah, there's that element of the common people wanting a hero, which we still have today with people like Ned Kelly. We have it now with the reinvention of Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was a criminal.
Yeah.
He was going to blow up Parliament and kill 1,000 people and anybody who just happened to be passing the area. It was a terrorist attempt. He's not a hero. It was terrorism. He would have wiped out the House of Commons, the House of Lords, most of the royal family, but not all of them. The glass would have gone everywhere. The nearby Abbey, Westminster, the glass would have been shattered. So anyone standing next to them would have been shredded to pieces. Masonry would have gone a mile out from the explosion and landed on cottages and houses. It's not a heroic act blowing somewhere up. But we have turned him over the last 50 years into a folk hero. He's even credited with it, but he wasn't the person behind it. The person behind it was a guy called Catesby. Not Guy Fawkes was the hired thug, brought in from Spain where he was fighting for the Spanish. He was hired to do the job by other members of the gentry who weren't going to do it. And if he had succeeded, and if you read up some of this, like Antonio Fraser and other historians, they will point out that if it had succeeded, it would have been the end of the Catholics in this country, because he wanted to raise an army of Catholics, and there wasn't enough of them, and they would have been wiped out in the same way as, sadly, we wiped out the Jews in the reign of Henry VI, or Richard II, not Henry VI. So, you know, everybody sort of reinvents history at some point. When you start looking at the what actually happened, it's not always that nice. It's not always as clear cut.
Sorry, that was me.
Was it?
I was moving a stool.
I thought it was Rosie.
Right.
So, you know, you've got, so in a sense, you've got Robin Hood as a socialist hero fighting for the lower classes. He then gets changed into becoming more of a gentrified hero, but he's still fighting for the rights of the people, because even the rich don't like paying taxes. I think we all know that, don't we know? So they'll always find something to complain about with regards to their government, no matter what the government is. You know, so you know, it will be taxation, it will be not being allowed to dress your followers in livery, which is a law that Henry VII brought in, to, you know, all sorts of things like that. So they'll always find something to have a go at or complain about. And yeah, so you've got heroes all the time coming up from the underbelly of society. Most of them don't become as big as Robin Hood and, you know, Guy Fawkes, really. Anymore.
Right.